So, Robin, any good?
It's just not a good game. Horrible and violent, unsettling and weird and awful and scary and dark and bleak and creepy.
Now, if you ask someone, what do you want out of a game, I'm guessing a pretty common answer would be to have fun, to get transported to another world, where you can build a big fat mansion out of diamonds, fight villains as a superhero, or become a literal god. You know, to escape reality and end up with a big old smile on your face. But in the game I'll be discussing today, What Remains of Edith Finch, this is not what we are given, because despite being one of the most immersive, cleverly written, well-designed games I've ever played, I would have a hard time actually calling it a fun experience. A more suitable word would be heartbreaking, telling the tale of a generational curse that snatches the lives of an entire family over 100 years. Just beating us in the head with tragedy after tragedy, and yet despite this, you can't put the controller down. So how does it manage to tap into our morbid curiosity in such an effective way? Well, let's join the world's unluckiest family and get to the bottom of this heart-breaking curse.
I think we've been surrounded by death for so long, we've just gotten used to it.
Now, What Remains of Edith Finch isn't your average game, because it's essentially a playable movie, and I know people tend to say that anytime a game has a good story. I mean, it makes sense. Just look at any cutscene from the new Spider-Man game.
We are healthy, strong.
But I'd argue that the drive of titles like these is still the gameplay. This comes first, and the amazing stories are there to help keep us engaged. But What Remains of Edith Finch really does feel like a movie, because it's entirely story focused. There's no inventory or mission objectives. Instead, you spend the game being guided along by narration, being told exactly where to go and what to do.
After Milton disappeared, Mom sealed up all the bedrooms. Then Edie retaliated and drilled peepholes.
They don't want to reset you at the beginning of a level, because it's supposed to be one fluid story, with as little interruptions and distractions as possible. The aim isn't to challenge the player, it's to fully immerse them into this story. And because they don't want to break this immersion, the playtime is very short. You can complete the whole thing in just a couple hours, getting completely sucked into this world and leaving again in a single sitting. Kinda like a trip to the movies.
Show the movie!
And this style of game only really works when the story can carry its weight. And boy, does Edith Finch deliver. So what's it all about? The game follows Edith Finch. I know, shock. A 17-year-old girl and the last remaining member of the Finches, as she returns to her family home to come to grips with her troubling past.
I hadn't been back since my brother Lewis's funeral.
But even though Edith is our main character, the one we play this story through, she's more of a vessel to tell the family's history as a whole. Her story is split up by tales of her different relatives, as we play through their final moments from their perspectives, all of which have met very poetic but ultimately tragic endings, many of which long before their time. And I was so amazed at how every single story felt so unique and still managed to have an impact on me despite going in knowing that each one is destined to end in death. And these stories don't just end the same way, they're set off the same way too. As we explore the house, we quickly learn that all the bedrooms are locked, so the goal is to find our way inside them. You know, a cheeky bit of breaking and entering. And once we do, we'll find a shrine dedicated to a family member, showing us something about their personality that made them unique, as well as some kind of text talking about their final moments. Maybe a poem, a comic book, a psychiatrist's letter. And it's these texts we play through to learn their tragic tales.
Dear Diary, I'll be gone soon, but I wanted to tell somebody about what's gonna happen.
Goodbye, everyone. I can't believe I've been down here for 30 years.
Meaning the one telling us about how the death went down changes from person to person. As soon as you notice the pattern and understand what the game is, learning the family history becomes addictive. You'll enter one of the memories and instantly look around, trying to figure out what's going to go wrong. What decisions were made in their final moments to take things from a seemingly normal situation to an early grave. And because so many of these deaths were unexpected and pretty unusual, the Finches are famous for their bad luck.
For 500 years, the Finches have been famous throughout Norway for their fortune and misfortune.
A family curse. But where did this curse begin? Who was patient zero? Well, our story begins all the way back in 1937 with Odin Finch, whose story we learn about through a reel. And no, not Instagram reels, but a proper old-fashioned newsreel. Or should I say, real news. Flicking through the slides, we see that this curse didn't actually begin with Odin. It's been going on for 500 years. But Odin is as far back as we learn about it.
Odin Finch buries the latest victims of the family curse.
After losing his wife and newborn child, he decides he's had enough of this curse, and he's going to do something about it. Something drastic. And it's a great story to set the tone of just how badly affected by this curse the Finches truly are. His plan is to take not just his remaining family members, but their entire home and move it across the ocean from Sweden to America, in hopes that the curse will remain on the other side of the sea. But like always with the Finches, things don't go to plan, and the house, with Odin still inside, sinks just off the coast before they reach their destination.
But 40-foot waves off the coast of Washington send the house and Odin to the bottom of the sea.
And this is the first sign that what looms over the Finch's shoulders might not be some magical curse, but actually a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because by trying to avoid the curse, he's actually made it come true. If he'd have accepted his family's death, instead of trying to run away, he might have been alive to see his grandchildren grow up. It's not explained why Odin is the only family member to go down with the house, but there's a chance he saw this as some kind of honourable death. Kind of like a captain going down with the ship, just with his family home instead. Perhaps he believed that the curse would die with him, but we'll soon see that's not the case. The Finches are strong-willed, and after the rest of his family escape by lifeboat to the nearest island, rather than making the same mistake, trying to run away to escape the curse, they decide to stay and build a new Finch family home right there on the shore. But this classic tale of a man trying to defy an inevitable fate will set the tone for the next generation of Finches.
Odin Finch is the first to be buried in the new family cemetery.
Odin's plan has failed. The curse wasn't broken by relocating. In fact, it seems that all he's done is added to the paranoia and superstition. The original house he sunk in lying just off the shore.
She could see it poking out of the water at low tide.
A constant reminder for the family of how things started here, as though the curse is whispering out from the sea that they could be next. But I guess, looking on the bright side, their new family home is unreal. This is the same house we explore throughout the game, and it just screams mystery. From the way it's isolated, hidden down a forest path, to the secret tunnels and passages connecting the rooms.
The passages were a pretty tight fit. They'd obviously been built for smaller hands and bellies.
Only accessible by solving puzzles and riddles.
There's a secret in this bathroom. It's in the last place you would look. It isn't in the cupboard. It's hidden in this book.
The Finches clearly watch a lot of Scooby-Doo.
In a big mansion like this, there's gotta be a secret passage.
It really does seem like an environment where your passions are encouraged, with actors and artists and DIY. Each Finch's room is decorated so differently, and it's not just the rooms, but different floors feel like they belong in different houses. But even though it's cool, I gotta be honest, this definitely ain't regulation.
Bad boy.
And despite such a fun and whimsical house, Edith says as a child it made her uncomfortable.
As a child, the house made me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't put into words.
Probably because of the Finch's approach to death. When a family member would pass away, their room would be kept untouched to help preserve their memory, which might be nice if it was 1 or 2 family members, but when there's more rooms in your home for the dead than the living, I can see it being a constant reminder of your own mortality all around you that you can't escape. All I'd be able to think about when walking down these halls is, I could be the next one to fall victim to this curse. And I think this line pretty much sums up what it might be like to grow up here.
Nothing in the house looked abnormal. There was just too much of it, like a smile with too many teeth.
In an attempt to keep the memories of the dead alive, they've turned something which should be warm and comforting into an overcrowded graveyard. There's too many rooms, too many graves, too many trinkets belonging to the dead, and it's overwhelming.
As a kid, I just assumed every house had peepholes and sealed rooms you weren't allowed inside of.
Despite being the first Finch to pass away chronologically, the game begins with someone opening Edith's journal, before fading to her walking down the trail to the home. It's been 7 years since she was last here, and very quickly she's hit with a wave of nostalgia.
For the first time in years, I felt like I was home.
Floods of memories coming back to her, the kind you only really remember when stood in a place that was once so familiar, or you hear a sound, smell a scent that transports you back to a specific moment in time.
Like how after Lewis started working at the cannery, we all got sick of eating salmon. Except our cat, Molly.
Once inside the home, we see that it lies untouched, exactly how Edith remembers it. We'll later learn that on the night they left, they did so in a hurry, with no time to pack or put the house up for sale. Probably because it's not bloody regulation.
You're a bad boy.
And this is probably my only flaw with the game. The fact that no one has come along and stashed a bike or a bit of jewellery or spray painted a giant on the wall, but I'm willing to suspend my disbelief if it leads to a better story, and it does. The reason the house is so creepy is because on the inside, it looks like a fun family home, as though children could have been running around playing just yesterday.
Great-Grandpa Sven built a music box for Barbara, along with the rest of the house.
It doesn't need to look like the house from Resident Evil 7 because the context of what happened here is unsettling enough. Now, Edith has never actually stepped foot in any of her dead relatives' rooms. The reason being her mother locked them all away when she was young, fearing that spending time in these rooms would get into the children's heads, just fueling the curse further.
After Milton disappeared, Mom sealed up all the bedrooms.
But these rooms do have peepholes which we can peep through, giving us a clue at the stories to come. And the first of these rooms we enter belongs to Molly, the granddaughter of Odin who managed to escape from the sinking house. Her story dates all the way back to the 1940s, meaning this room has laid untouched for nearly a century. As Edith invades her privacy and opens up her diary, we're greeted with the haunting line, "I'll be gone soon," before entering her final moments, or at least Molly's account of her final moments. And keep in mind, this is a 10-year-old girl with a vivid imagination, and so her way of making sense of what's happening to her is like something out of a fantasy book, a story of shapeshifting and monsters. But just like with every Finch's story, things start off fairly normal, with Molly waking up in the middle of the night.
It started when Mom sent me to bed without dinner.
And we quickly learn that whilst the family and the press are quick to use the word curse, what really set off poor Molly's passing was neglect. Because she wasn't just sent to bed without dinner, but her door is locked.
Mom, can I come out now?
Sweetheart, it's late. Go to sleep.
I'm assuming this is another punishment, but we don't learn what for. Not that it really matters, it's never okay to lock your child in their room. I mean, what if there's a fire? Or what if they get hungry and start eating various items they find around their room? Items which may seem harmless at first glance, but can do serious damage when combined. And Molly doesn't seem just, "Oh, I've missed one meal hungry." No, she seems starving.
I thought about eating Christopher, but I held back.
Because I find it hard to believe that a well-fed child would do what Molly does next. She searches around her bedroom eating 3 different items, the first of which is gerbil food, which on its own is fine, but you can see droppings uncomfortably close to where the food sat. This could easily cause disease and contamination, but the effects might take a while to show. So what about the next item? Toothpaste. Well, a little to brush your teeth, a-okay. But eat enough of this tube and you've probably ingested some nasty chemicals, especially back in 1947. Not enough to kill you by any means, but enough to upset your stomach, which brings us to the final item, holly berries, which are poisonous and can easily be fatal, especially to a child. All of these items on their own might not have been fatal, but together they make a pretty deadly cocktail. And this story is heartbreaking enough, but it's made worse by the fact that the gameplay is first person. In this moment, we are Molly. We have to pick up these items and eat them in order for the game to progress. So in a way, it almost feels like we're causing her death.
I ate a lot of things that night.
Most games, when you finish a level, might give you a little reward, maybe a new piece of gear, enough XP to level up, or skill points to learn a slick new trick. But all you get for completing Molly's story is the tragic death of an innocent girl, and so as you continue to play, that dread just builds and builds, knowing that with every second that passes, we're getting closer and closer to what we already know has taken place, and no matter how well you play, you cannot overcome the problem. But Molly's story doesn't end when she eats the berries. We get to see the effects of her feast firsthand. And from this moment on, everything that she writes is a lot more open to interpretation, as she is likely now hallucinating from the berries. Molly sees a cat outside her window, and then she becomes it.
And suddenly, I was a cat.
And doing what a cat does, she parkours around the house, trying to catch this bird. Her story spirals as she shapeshifts from one animal to another, always a predator, transforming into an owl catching rabbits.
And suddenly, I was an owl.
Then a shark catching juicy seals.
I wanted fat, juicy seals.
Before finally a slimy sea monster looking for sailors to chew on. I think subconsciously she knows that what she's eaten and death are connected, and it might be a coincidence, but I do find it interesting how her mother was the one to send her to bed without dinner, and in her final moments she dreams of eating a mama bird and a mama rabbit.
A mama rabbit.
It's as though this resentment and all these different aspects of her death are bleeding into her hallucinations. Mother, dinner, eat. Like how it's common to dream about the last thing you thought of before slipping into unconsciousness. And because young Molly herself is narrating her story, you have this really sweet, innocent voice talking about all kinds of messed up stuff.
I imagined his face looking up and seeing mine through my talons.
It creates these two really conflicting emotions, like when a kid is trying to sound tough, but they just end up sounding cute. Going by IMDb, this is the voice actress's only role, and she absolutely kills it.
Now I was a monster, and I smelled people everywhere.
After her shape-shifting feast, still in the form of this monster, she crawls up through a pipe and into what is revealed to be her bedroom. We're back where we started. And now this same monster which Molly saw herself as, the one so hungry it just had to keep feeding, has come for her.
But it's not going to wait much longer. It needs to feed, and we both know I will be delicious.
And the reason she's so sure she'll be delicious is because she herself has known what it's like to be this monster, already felt the satisfaction of catching her prey. She doesn't seem confused over her situation or angry at this monster. From the very first line, she's accepted her fate.
I'll be gone soon.
This is the first story we play through, and it's a great introduction for what's to come, setting up the idea that actually, these deaths might not have been from some magical curse, and in some cases were actually preventable. There's fantasy elements in there, but just like the curse, whether they're real or not is open to interpretation.
I'm not sure if I believed all of that, but I'm sure Edie would have.
The next room we enter belongs to Edith's grandfather, Calvin, who shared this space with his twin brother, Sam, but only one of these twins would ever reach adulthood. Now, Calvin's story, unlike Molly's, isn't told from the perspective of the dead. Instead, we hear it from his brother in the form of an essay, talking about how he wants to remember him as well as his thoughts and feelings surrounding his death.
How I Want to Remember My Brother by Sam Finch.
In terms of gameplay, his story is one of the easiest, and none of the levels are particularly hard, so that's saying a lot. It begins by fading into Calvin sitting on the swing, and you simply push the thumbstick forward and back, over and over, going higher and higher each time. So again, kid on a swing, pretty normal, right? But the first thing you'll notice is that this swing is built dangerously close to a cliff. Now, I wouldn't say I'm the kind of guy that thinks rope swings should be cut down and parks should be made overly safe. Go crack your head open and have fun. But in this situation, where you have a family who's known for dying in bizarre ways, often terrible accidents, maybe don't build a swing by a cliff. But I guess I'm just a boring But the Finches are stubborn, and it's this stubbornness which sets Calvin's death into motion, deciding that he's going to be a little stuntman and go fully around on this swing, which is fueled by a conversation between him and his twin after their sister's funeral.
At Barbara's funeral, we swore we'd never be afraid again, and he wasn't.
But the problem is, he takes this promise a little too literally, because a little bit of fear is what keeps you alive. There's a reason why we're scared of heights and wild animals and going fully around on a swing. It's because these things can kill us. But then, on the other hand, too much fear and you never truly live. And this sliding scale of fear is something which is explored constantly throughout the game, especially when it comes to the fear of death. But perhaps the most tragic element of Calvin's story is what his brother writes in his essay about why it might have happened. Still grieving, naturally he's looking for answers, and some of those answers fall on himself.
I told him going around was impossible. Maybe if I hadn't said that.
But of course, it's not his fault at all. He was just trying to protect him. And from the cast on Calvin's leg and a black eye seen on his character model, this isn't his first attempt. And if breaking his leg doesn't stop him from trying, then what will? But this kind of guilt that can come from losing a loved one often isn't based in rationality. Although it does seem that writing all this down does help him come to terms with the accident, realizing that looking for blame won't help anyone.
That's what I want to remember about my brother. The day he made up his mind to fly. And he did.
But of course, Calvin's passing does still leave a lasting impact on Sam, not only because he's lost his twin, but also because of the way that the Finches deal with it going forward, roping off Calvin's side of the room, preserving it like an exhibition in a museum.
After the funeral, Edie roped off Calvin's half of the room.
But the thing is, Sam still sleeps here, meaning for 7 years until he moved out, the first thing he saw when he woke up and the last thing he saw before he fell asleep was the memory of his dead twin. Again, it's important to remember the dead, but when a reminder this big is constantly there and you can't escape it, it can quickly become overwhelming. And it seems that Sam feels this way too, because the day he turned 18, he moved out and joined the military, which does seem like something he's always had in mind, but it's probably just as true that he wanted to leave this room behind the moment he could.
I guess my grandpa didn't like history any more than my mom did.
This is the first of many losses which Sam will have to face throughout his life, but for now, he's safe. The next Finch to fall victim to the curse is Barbara, a tragic tale looking at the more grisly sides of the film industry, how child stars are often cast away, and real-life murders sensationalized, exaggerating things and skewing facts with little regard to the victims or their families.
Of all the stories people wrote about Barbara's death, I'm surprised Edie saved this one.
Barbara was just 16 years old when she died, and the way her story is shown is one of the more unique out the bunch. Rather than seeing her final moments from her perspective, like with Molly, or seeing it from a loved one like the twins, instead it's from a comic book, which has turned her painful story into a colourful Halloween special.
The surprise ending of Barbara Finch.
And because of this outsider's perspective, I think it's fair to say that Barbara's story is the furthest from the actual truth. It's not even narrated by Edith or one of the family members. Instead, it's this spooky pumpkinhead fella, whose voice is just delightful.
Old Jack here with another ghastly tale.
Now, Barbara became famous at a very young age, from her knockout scream in a cult horror movie, a skill which she has since lost. And this comic isn't just overstepping, being written a single year after her death while the wound is still fresh. It's also cruel, calling Barbara washed up and a has-been at just 16 years old. Nobody's washed up at 16. That's literally halfway through your teenage years. But the truth is, a lot of child stars probably do feel this way. You're given all this attention before you can even comprehend what it truly means, at an age where most people haven't even figured out what they want to do with their lives. And then it can be taken away from you, often for factors beyond your control. Even something as simple as aging it can get you cast out the spotlight. And the way that people see you is forever influenced by something you did as a child. Oh yeah, that's Barbara Finch, that one girl from that one movie from years ago. Even Edith, one of her own family members, says this is how she always saw her, as the child star. It's only now that she's older she realises things weren't so simple.
I never thought about how hard it must have been for her afterwards.
Now, just like Molly's story, there are many different ways we can interpret what we're told. Not just because we're seeing it from an outsider's perspective, but also because Barbara was murdered, and the case isn't exactly cut and dry.
Well, gang, it looks like we're up to our armor plates in another mystery.
So let's run through the comic's account of what happened that night. Barbara and her boyfriend, Nick, are hanging out on Halloween night, practicing on regaining her iconic scream, as she's been invited to a horror movie convention to recreate it. But unfortunately, after her father gets into an accident, she's forced to cancel her appearance as she needs to babysit her brother, Waltuh. And from the little dialogue we get from her boyfriend Nick, it seems that even he sees her as the child star. When the comic describes him, biggest fan comes first and boyfriend comes second, and is in brackets, implying it's the less important of the two. And the tone of their interactions is kind of like a director giving notes to an actor.
Getting better? I think you just need the right motivation. Okay, I'm hearing frustration, but I'm not hearing terror.
He even goes as far as to hide in the basement with a mask, trying to scare her into performing her scream.
Oh dear.
Which understandably gets him kicked out. But now she's all alone, and after hearing a scream coming from her brother Waltuh, she goes to investigate, but Waltuh is nowhere to be found. Instead, she's greeted by the infamous Hook Man.
I'm getting stabbed with this hook hand thing!
Oh my god!
And old Barb puts up a good fight, using the secret passages to sneak behind the Hook Man, pushing him through the railing. But by the time she gets downstairs to finish him off like a bad bitch, he's gone. And it turns out the Hook Man isn't the only intruder in the house. All the monsters from the convention have come to surprise her. But these monsters aren't just playing dress up, they're the real deal. The real vampire, the real mummy. I don't know what this is. And doing what monsters do, they eat her alive. They just couldn't go without hearing her iconic scream. All that's left is her ear in the music box. Whew. I know that was a lot, so let's talk about what was likely real and what was likely fake. The only thing we can be pretty much certain about is that someone did fall through the railing, because when walking around the house earlier in the game, you can clearly see that it's been fixed back up. But who that person was and whether they were pushed or they fell, we do not know. But we can make an educated guess based on the information we're given. Now, I believe that there actually was 3 people in the house at the time of the murder. Barbara, because, of course, she's the victim. Her brother, Waltuh, because we see in the following story how traumatized he is. And lastly, boyfriend Nick, because of what the comic says at the end.
Of course, the police blamed it all on poor Rick, who disappeared the same night.
The way this is phrased is like they're implying, this is what the police and the press and the public will have you think, but our story is the real story. You can trust us. This pumpkinhead fella wouldn't lie to you now, would he? I think instead of the Hook Man being pushed through the railing, it was actually Barbara, and this is what killed her. Because there's not a trace of blood in the music box where her ear was supposedly found. And I think being so crucial to the case, it would almost definitely be taken in as evidence. But no, here it is on their shelf. And I think all of these monsters, including the Hook Man and the convention itself, is all make-believe imagined up by the comic. The whole point is it's dramatized. Even the voice actors for Barbara's story sound so cartoony.
Oh dear!
Getting better. I think you just need the right motivation.
and I'm pretty sure it's intentional, at least I hope it's intentional. If it's not, I'm sorry to the voice actors. But what reason could they possibly have to exaggerate things? Probably because the truth is much more ordinary. A more realistic version of events is that there was an argument between Barbara and Nick, but instead of ending with him being kicked out, it ended in death, leaving him to hunt down Waltuh, the only witness.
And little Waltuh? Hiding under his bed the whole time. He took it all pretty hard, but that's another story.
But who knows if even a single piece of this comic is true. Nick might not even be a real person. Barbara might not have even been murdered. She could have simply slipped while wearing rollerblades and gone through the railing all on her own. When we finally do hear from Waltuh, all he has to say is, "Whatever killed Barbara." So we never do get the answers we're looking for. But if it was simply an accident, this would make the comics version of events even more disrespectful. But I guess, aside from the mystery of how Barbara actually died, there is in some way a poetic ending to be found here, because Barbara always dreamed of being remembered.
Edie told me all Barbara wanted was to be remembered.
And even if not in the way she would have hoped for, she definitely left a mark. Stories were written about her. And even though this one is exploitive, this is just one of many.
Of all the stories people wrote about Barbara's death, I'm surprised Edie saved this one.
And at the very least, she's the star of the show, and not simply a side character in her own death, overshadowed by whoever or whatever took her life. Now luckily, we don't have to wait long to find out how this experience affected Waltuh, because through Barbara's story, we learn the true secret of the music box. Continue to twist the handle after the music stops playing and the basement key is revealed. And boy, does Edith have balls of steel. Because if I went back to my abandoned family home, tucked away in the woods, and filled with memories of my dead loved ones, no way am I going in that basement. I'm not even going in the house.
That's our cutest canoe!
If there's any truth to the comic, and Waltuh did see his sister's death, then this alone would be enough to break someone. But then you add the curse on top of this, and you're left with a boy who's terrified of the world. At this point, 3 of his relatives have died before they've even reached adulthood. And naturally, this scares Waltuh. Scares him enough to where he'll do anything to avoid becoming the next victim.
I remember asking Mom once about where Waltuh had gone. She said after Barbara died, he got as far away as he could.
His reaction to the curse is similar to Odin's in terms of how far he goes to try and escape it, but instead of running away to Benidorm or Ibiza, he completely hides away, becoming a hermit directly underneath the family home.
If there's a pattern in all these stories, I think it's that none of us has gotten very far.
And this dark bunker becomes Waltuh's home, not for a day, or a week, or a month, but 37 years. His fear of the curse has led him to remove anything that could possibly cause him harm. But by doing this, it means that every day plays out exactly the same song. The same tin of peaches. The same rumbling at the same time every single day without fail.
But if you wait long enough, you get used to anything.
And when living like this, away in the dark, days, weeks and months can easily blend together. There's no sunlight, no simple change in the sky that reminds him every morning and every night that the days are passing. And anyone who's ever gotten into a nocturnal sleep schedule, going to bed at 10 AM for weeks on end, can tell you how important it is to have that cycle. And often, any kind of change to your routine, no matter how small, is what can help you think differently. But down here, Waltuh is completely isolated and in control of every single thing. Nothing can influence his routine unless he allows it. So that change never comes, and he carries on hiding.
That's what kept me sane. Having a schedule, living for today.
Waltuh is on the complete opposite end of that scale of fear as young Calvin, where he was fearless to the point he became reckless. Waltuh is fearful to the point he's not even living, just waiting for his own death. And if every day is the same for 37 years, then does it really matter which is the last? And eventually, that small change to his routine finally shows itself. That rumbling which he hears at the same time every single day, the noise that he's been terrified of all these years, suddenly disappears.
And then one day, everything just stopped.
It's such a simple change, but it throws him off completely, making him realise he needs to face his fear of the curse and return to the outside world. So he picks up a sledgehammer, knocks down the wall of the bunker, and steps through onto a tunnel. And right away, the light of the entrance draws us in, just bright enough to make out that we're walking along train tracks. And this is where it starts to come together. In a game like this, where every character dies, the back of your mind is always scanning for what's going to cause the next death. And a Finch standing on train tracks is not a good sign. The stories are never very long, 10 minutes at most, so Waltuh's time must be running out. And just as he exits the tunnel, he's greeted by the sunlight for the first time in over 30 years. But then an even brighter light appears.
Imagine the sun on my face.
A train has come to strike him down. The same train which caused this rumbling. So it seems that he was right to fear it for all these years. Right to hide away underground. And right to believe in the curse. Because look what happened the moment he gave up control of his routine and left his future up to fate. It's as though the curse was out there waiting for him. Or was it? I can imagine for the rest of the family, Waltuh's death only helped to feed the superstition further. But really, just like Odin, the only reason the curse got him is because he was down there in the first place. If he'd have carried on with his life, he never would have been on the tracks that day. Just like how Odin wouldn't have found himself facing giant waves. But at least in the end, he tried to make a change, and was able to get freedom from this fear which plagued his whole life, even if just for a moment. And although it came to him a little late, what was the alternative? Stay underground for another 30 years until he inevitably dies of old age? At least this way, his final moments are spent looking up into the sky.
I'm going to appreciate all of it, especially the food. I'd be happy with one more day.
And just imagine how great this must look after 37 years in the dark. Following in Waltuh's footsteps, Edith walks along the tracks, and this is where we get a much needed look into her thoughts and feelings, who she is. What does she think about the curse?
But now I'm worried the stories themselves might be the problem. Maybe we believed so much in a family curse, we made it real.
We've been so caught up in her family stories that the only remaining Finch has almost taken a back seat, and by this point we've seen enough of the stories that the weight of the curse is fully established. So it's nice to have a small moment of reflection as Edith walks through the family graveyard. And this is where we get some information that helps to explain the title.
But I thought you should know about your family and the history you're a part of. If she told me there was going to be so much climbing, I never would have come when I was 22 weeks pregnant.
Whoa, 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 whoa. I guess congratulations are in order because Edith is pregnant. Up until this point, it's not really known who Edith is telling all this to. The game begins with someone opening up her journal, but we don't know who this person is. And this opening scene is so brief that by this point in the game, it's easy to have forgotten about it. And so I was kind of under the impression that Edith was talking to us, the player, just narrating her life story. But no, she isn't doing this for us, or even for herself. She's writing all this down for her unborn child.
Now that there's only one of us left, or maybe two.
Which brings us to what I believe is the most fascinating part of this story. As the last remaining Finch at this moment in time, Edith has a choice to make, and it's not an easy one. Does she keep all of this to herself and take the knowledge of the curse to the grave with her so that it's forgotten and no longer holds any power over the future Finches? Or does she owe it to her unborn child to tell them of the family history and the curse, even if it means it'll always be hanging over their heads? Of course, the rational thing to do is to let the curse die, move on and leave it in the past.
Maybe it'd be better if all this just died with me.
But the thing is, it's not just the curse she'd be letting die, it's also the memories of her loved ones, and that's much harder to just let go and fade away. Even if she doesn't use the word curse specifically, her children are bound to ask why all of their relatives are dead, and why so many at such a young age. And I know this is kind of a strange connection, but it makes me think of something that musician Absol said during one of his lyric breakdowns.
I just thought that was profound, and it's something that I can relate to. You know, if you don't say their name after they're gone, they die twice.
Meaning first goes the physical body, and then the memories follow. And it's up to us, as the ones left behind, to keep these memories alive. In Edith's case, that means Calvin and his fearlessness, Molly and her vivid imagination, Barbara and her big dreams, even if it hurts and feeds into the superstition. And all of this lies on her shoulders, because if she doesn't pass it down, then who will? And it's actually Edith's great-grandmother, Edie Finch, who is the biggest believer in keeping the history going. She is the one who created all these memorials, and the one who designed the family graveyard.
Sven built the house, but it was Edie who designed the cemetery.
And not just any graveyard with names and dates, but each stone shows the character and personality of the one buried below. Not just keeping their name alive, but who they were as a person. But the thing is, Edie is biased. She's the one who sent Molly to bed without dinner, the one who stood by while a swing was built next to a cliff. Edie needs the curse to be real, or she's simply a bad mother. And this dilemma of forgetting the curse but losing the memories in the process is a constant conflict between great-grandmother Edie and Edith's mother, Dawn, who has the complete opposite mindset, believing that the dead are in the past and you need to focus on the living. Where great-grandmother Edie preserves these rooms and builds memorials in them, Dawn locks them away and refuses to talk about the dead Finches.
After Milton disappeared, Mom sealed up all the bedrooms. Then Edie retaliated and drilled peepholes. My mom was always trying to move on, but for Edie, the past never went away.
And despite growing up around these two opposing mindsets, it's clear that Edith's feelings on the subject lean closer towards her great-grandmother's, who unsurprisingly she was named after. When discussing Waltuh, she says how she doesn't want to end up like her mother,
trying to bury something that's still alive.
She's not just talking about the uncle in the basement, but also the curse itself, the way she tries to cover it up and ignore it. But we've seen what happens when the Finches try and escape it, so would forgetting really be much different? What if Edith decides to keep all these stories to herself, and then they end up still being cursed anyway? The family history would be lost for nothing. So for now, Edith decides to carry on and learn the rest of the stories before making her decision. I mean, she's already listened to half of them, so what's she got to lose? How much more painful can it get? But first, she needs to find a way to access the upper floors, which are blocked off from downstairs. So what on earth are we gonna do? Find a hidden key which unlocks the previous door? Scout out the exterior to find a different way inside? Bust down the wall and start looting? Well, no. It's much simpler than that. We just have to do a bit of parkour, and Prego Edith is surprisingly agile. It's not a challenge at all. Even the route we climb up is given away by the floating narration and lies just outside the graveyard. Again, in any other game, I'd say this is too easy, but it means that the path we take is so fluid. We're not spending time walking back on ourselves or putting down the controller to look up how me get in house Edith Finch. It keeps the story moving. Now, what we've seen of the home so far is cool, don't get me wrong, but these upper floors are where it gets real interesting and the regulations really get ignored. I mean, look at this thing. One strong gust of wind and she's coming down. Oh no, meow. The first memorial we pass in the upper floors shows a familiar face, Calvin's twin brother, Sam, who wrote the essay from earlier. And taking a quick look at his memorial, we see he's one of the few Finches to reach adulthood, going on to have a family of his own. And quickly, just for context, this is Edith's grandfather. Here's a little glimpse at the family tree. If I'm being honest, Sam's story is my least favourite, partly because the gameplay throughout this sequence can be quite frustrating, not difficult, just jarring in comparison to the rest of the game. Usually, it's in the back of my mind, but here, it actually broke my immersion. Let me explain. Sam and his daughter, a young Dawn, are out in the woods on a hunting trip, and this time we're seeing events play out through a camera. So to progress to the next part of the story, you have to bring the camera into focus and snap a pic of the right thing.
Definitely should not have drunk all that coffee.
I understand what they were going for, but I just find myself aimlessly looking about. Although, I will admit, I'm a pretty bad gamer, so it's probably just a skill issue. Where is it? Come on, where she be? Where she be at? The real problem comes towards the end of Sam's story, when he places the camera down to get a photo of him and Dawn, who is just in tears by the way. Keep in mind, she's just shot and killed a deer for the first time. I mean, read the room, Sam, come on. So this is the last of the photos, moments before his death. Arguably the most important part of his story. You want the tension to be at its highest, but instead I was taken out of it when we switch from the camera's point of view to controlling Sam in third person.
I'm proud of you, Dawn. Always remember that, okay?
And it's such an unnatural moment because we've always been first person up until this point. I think they were going the original Resident Evil route, where the camera stays fixed and the characters move independently, to make it feel like we're a helpless observer, which is cool in theory, but in Sam's story it's just thrown at us too suddenly. So chances are you'll just bump along the edges of this path, doing that awkward running in motion. Even the way he dies feels a little out of nowhere. As he reaches the deer for the photo, it turns out to still be alive, and as the timer reaches 0, it knocks him off the cliff.
Try not to think about—
Dad!
And seeing how his brother died from falling off a cliff, you'd think he'd be a bit more hesitant to get right up on the edge. But then again, I am comparing this to what I consider 10 other masterpieces, so even though it's my least favourite, I still think it's pretty decent.
And I'm giving this one an
decent. One thing I do really like about this story is that it can't be influenced by the narrator, because the camera doesn't lie or embellish, it just shows. Which is probably why this one is a lot of people's favourite, because it actually gives us some definite answers. Now, arguably, the most important takeaway from Sam's death is the impact it has on the one who witnesses it, Dawn. These two are the most serious Finches.
I think he and my mom had a lot in common. They were both pretty intense.
And it's not surprising given how much these two have in common, both having lost all of their loved ones at such a young age, surviving the curse for long enough to grow up and start their own families. And because they survived, it's easy to see them as the lucky ones. But really, the older they get, the more of their loved ones they see pass, especially as Finches. Dawn's father isn't her first loss, and it won't be her last either, because she had two brothers, 12-year-old Gus and baby Gregory. And boy, are things about to get really, really sad. Well, sadder than they already are. So here's your warning. You don't see anything and it's all implied, but still. That being said, let's jump in. Approaching Gregory's memorial really took me off guard, because at first, all we can see is a little head poking out of a crib. You see, Edith doesn't fill in the family tree with illustrations until after we've played through their stories, so there's pretty much no way of knowing what the Finches look like. You can figure out how old they are by pausing the game and reading the dates of death, but I have a feeling that most players, myself included, aren't going to do this. Of course, this uneasy feeling wasn't completely new. We've played as mostly children up until this point, but seeing a baby grinning from ear to ear in a game like this just gives a horrible feeling. But again, that morbid curiosity draws us in. Technically, you can actually skip most of the stories in the game. You simply walk past the memorial and don't engage.
No, I don't think I will.
The only ones you actually have to play through to finish the story are Molly's, because it's the first, Edie's, because it's the last, and Barbara's, because it reveals the location of the hidden key. But obviously, if you miss out 80% of the stories in a game about stories, then there's not much point. Plus, this information isn't very clear. It's not told to us, we have to figure it out. And there's no reason to assume we'd be able to skip these stories, because they're separated from one another, off in their own rooms. We're only being shown one at a time, so it has our full attention in this moment. But this room is different, because there are two memorials, the two brothers side by side, as though the game is reminding you at this moment that you can just walk past and skip this one. Leave it, go on to Gus's story, but they know that you probably won't. As always, Gregory's story opens with a pretty innocent picture, a bit of bath time, but his parents are nowhere to be seen until his mother arrives to get him out. But the problem is, her attention is scattered when it should be on her child in the bath. Just as she's about to pull the plug, the phone rings and she walks off to answer it.
Hold on, sweetie.
Leaving Gregory to his own devices. And I know he isn't completely helpless, but you'd be surprised how little time and how little water it takes for something to go wrong. But she's off arguing with tone-deaf Sam, as the pair are having marriage troubles. And this time, the narration is from a note written on divorce papers, from Sam to Gregory's mother.
Dear Kay, do you remember the way Gregory used to laugh when he thought he was alone?
But as Gregory is our point of view, and only a baby whose mind is full of wonder, we aren't focused on all that nonsense. The pain, the arguing, the divorce. Instead, it's a fun game, where we take control of a little toy frog, jumping out of the water to pop bubbles, freeing the poor rubber duckies trapped inside. And as you free them, they all jump around in a synchronized dance. And with all of this imagination on display, this story kind of reminds me of Molly's. But Molly was 10 years old when she died, and so a bit more aware.
I'll be gone soon.
But Gregory isn't nearly old enough to understand what's happening to him. He's off in his own little world, a world full of joy and fun, something which his dad, tone-deaf Sam, is worried about. Yes, that's right, that his 1-year-old son is too much of a dreamer, which is obviously ridiculous, but makes a lot more sense when you consider Sam's past and how his brother died, trying to achieve the impossible. And it's probably the same reason his daughter says he's always serious.
Turn off your imagination. Focus on your target.
I assume he has little love left for imagination, feeling as though it led his brother away from reality. But in the end, it's this imagination that helps him grieve, making his son's tragic fate seem not so scary. In fact, Gregory welcomes it. After his mother disappears for the final time, Gregory turns on the tap so this fun dance can continue, the water rising until he is submerged. But instead of being scared, he swims directly over to the drain and down into it, going willingly. But the thing is, Gregory's story isn't actually shown in this warm way because it's the mind of a child. No, these stories have always been influenced by the text being narrated. So this bath time tragedy isn't actually Gregory's perspective. It's his father's. This whole story is really just Sam saying, "My son isn't gone, he went to go play with his friends." And whether he's painting it this way to help his ex-wife heal or to relieve some of his own guilt, we do not know. I mean, Sam was the one to call that night, but there's no way he could have possibly known. It's just really unfortunate timing. But like always with the Finches, history repeats itself, because just like with his twin's death all those years ago, writing his feelings down helps him come to terms with the loss. So maybe great-grandmother Edie is right. It's better to get things out in the open and talk about these deaths. The house is so full of secrets, from the bedrooms being locked away, to the uncle living in the basement, even Edith not knowing any of her family history. And instead of stopping the deaths, it just creates an environment where the Finches don't feel comfortable talking openly, leading to devastating consequences. And there's no better example of this than Gregory's brother, Gus. Gus's final day alive was the wedding of his father to his second wife, down at the same beach where the family first stepped foot on the island all those years ago. And Gus is feeling a lot of inner turmoil over this wedding. You see, he doesn't need a new mum, and this inner turmoil sometimes becomes outer turmoil.
When the time for photos came, Dad ordered him to come here. But Gus declined and as a sign held up his middle finger.
Rather than participating in the wedding, Gus stands off on his own flying his kite, distracting himself from how he really feels. But pop a lid on these feelings and it's only a matter of time before they boil over. And it's like father, like son, because Gus isn't the only one trying to cover up a problem that day. A storm's creeping in to threaten this beach wedding. And Sam, rather than accepting that the weather is a serious issue that needs addressing, instead shrugs it off.
The rain came down in buckets then, but no one seemed afraid that nature might destroy the tent our dad had created. The thunder sounded much too close and full of angry power. All my father said to this was, "Make the music louder."
And both of these issues are summed up by the kite we're controlling. As the story progresses, it collects more letters and more furniture, all trailing behind it, growing until it becomes a sort of monster, pushing through the air like a jellyfish. What started off as something small that he was in control of is now a huge shadow on the horizon, and Gus can do nothing to stop it as it heads directly for him. Stepping back from the fantasy of it all, it probably wasn't a flying furniture monster that killed Gus, but actually, the totem pole sat dangerously close to where he stood. When walking past it earlier in the game, we see it's fallen down, and you can actually see it start to topple over just before Gus falls. It seems that all these years of grief have finally caught up to Sam. This is the cruelest we see him throughout the game.
Our father never hit us kids, at least not very hard, before the day my brother said with teenage disregard, "Come here."
But the twisted part is, his grief causes him anger, but then his anger causes him more grief. It's a vicious cycle. If he'd have confronted his pain instead of letting it fester, then maybe his son would still be alive. If he was more understanding of Gus's feelings, then maybe he wouldn't have been so unwilling to attend this wedding that he'd rather stay outside in a deadly storm. And if he'd have accepted that the weather was serious, he could have done the right thing and made sure everyone got inside, including Gus. But there is no poetic resolution between father and son to be found here. This ending is cold, based in harsh reality, because the one who wrote this poem is Dawn.
I can't imagine my mom ever writing poetry, and yet...
Had great-grandmother Edie written this poem, it probably would have ended the second he got swallowed, but instead it carries on, with Dawn saying how she didn't even think of him that day.
I wish that I could truly say I thought about you on that day. Out there on the beach alone, just you, the wind, the sea and foam. But I didn't, until we found you.
And this poem has a pretty consistent rhyme scheme throughout, but as soon as Gus dies, Dawn breaks from the theatrics, and so the rhyming stops too, becoming much more natural in a dialogue, the hard truth, as though writing this poem down didn't help her heal, and she's tired of hiding behind a story. It's yet another example of these stories telling us more about the ones writing them than the ones they're about.
She never talked about him, but Mom told me once if I was a boy, they were going to name me Gus.
With all of the stories of Sam's children are told, we now move on to the youngest generation, and Edith's immediate family, starting with her brother, Milton, who earlier in the game we learnt is missing from a poster as we enter the property. And I hope you're ready for the coolest room in the game. No, scratch that, the universe.
The beginning of the end was Milton's 10th birthday, when Edie gave him a castle.
That's right, this boy got a castle, a tower with a see-through dome at the top, giving him a 360 view of the island and the sea. Oh, what I would do for a room like this. Despite being just 11 years old when he disappeared, Milton was a talented artist, with drawings and paint scattered all over his room. Now, when I first wrote out this video, this was the shortest section by far, because Milton's story is the shortest by far. But take a look at everything surrounding his story, and you'll find yourself deep down the rabbit hole. Although, at first, all we're given is a simple flip book, showing Milton discover that he is in possession of a magic paintbrush. Whatever he paints becomes real, and using this brush, he paints a door on the wall before stepping through, never to be seen again. Now, there are quite a few theories surrounding what happened to Milton. One of the more common ones is that he found the secret passages and began to explore them, which is why he sees them as magic. But he went too deep and got lost within the walls.
From the paintings on the wall, it was clear my brother Milton had been here before me. Lewis told me there were secret passages, but I never believed him.
When Edith describes his disappearance, she says it was like the house swallowed him up. But with the way this story is presented, the bow before he leaves, the smile on his face, and the fact that he doesn't seem frightened of where he's going, leads me to believe that one day he decided that he wasn't going to let the curse define him, so he ran away to start a new life. I mean, this is nothing new. Both Odin and Waltuh had a similar mindset, so what makes Milton's story any different? Well, while Odin tried to run from the curse and Waltuh tried to hide from it, they both forgot to remove the family part of the family curse. Yes, Odin travelled halfway across the world, but he brought his home with him, his family with him, And the curse was never tied to one place, it was tied to the Finches. So of course all this death follows them. And yes, Waltuh hid away, but he did so directly underneath the family home. The curse was still on his mind every day, ruling his decision to stay down there. So it's hard to call these starting new. When these characters died, they were still very much Finches. But Milton's story feels different. It seems more hopeful. I believe wherever he went, he was successful in leaving it all behind. All that generational trauma, fear and superstition, and that wherever he is now, he's only a Finch by birth, with no connection to his past. And I like how it seems as though Milton is the one who painted this book, writing his own story, and how at the end there are several pages left blank. Which to me is just more evidence that he made it out, and his story isn't over, and Milton is the only family member in which his memorial has no end date, just the year he was born, showing that great-grandmother Edie still believed that he was out there somewhere. But we'll never know. His story remains unfinished. Or does it? The Unfinished Swan is another title from the same studio, Giant Sparrow, released 5 years before What Remains of Edith Finch, and the story in this game has a lot of parallels to Milton's story. We play as a young boy, Monroe, and you know what, let me just play the game's opening and you'll see what I mean.
Monroe's mother had always been much better at starting things than finishing them. When she died, she left behind over 300 canvases, not one of them finished, along with Monroe, who felt pretty unfinished himself. The orphanage allowed him to keep only one painting, and so he chose the unfinished swan that had always been his mother's favorite. But that night, he woke up to find the swan had disappeared. So he took his mother's silver paintbrush and followed the footprints into a little door he hadn't seen before.
So, 2 stories from the same studio about a young boy who uses a magical paintbrush to enter another world. Surely Milton has to be Monroe, right? Or at least inspired by him. Well, no. But he might be his son. At first, this place which Monroe finds himself in seems to be just an empty canvas, but as you throw down balls of paint, shapes and objects begin to reveal themselves, and the path through this world is revealed. Following this path, we learn of the king, the one who used his powers to create this world. But wherever he is now, it's not here. This place lies in ruin. You see, this king didn't exactly do the best job, and so all his subjects left. And like we all do when we're feeling lonely, he paints himself a companion, and this companion is Monroe's mother. But after falling pregnant, she disappears, leaving this king without his child, until he meets Monroe and passes down a paintbrush.
I've something for you. This brush isn't mine anymore. My work is over. It belongs to you.
So this king owns a brush just like Milton's, a crown just like Milton's. Even Edith herself calls Milton's tower a castle.
When Edie gave him a castle.
And this castle is pure white, as though it's been ripped straight from the canvas world. And when we finally do meet this king, he tells us that the house he left to go create this world was the house that he grew up in, meaning that he was likely young when he left.
It all began right there, in the house I grew up in.
And during a scene where the king dreams of his own funeral, no one is there other than Monroe, which would make sense because Milton hasn't seen his family since he was 11. A smaller funeral is to be expected.
I hope it makes you happy and that someday they will say, he is a better man than his father.
So, after learning all of this, I think it's pretty clear that this king is Milton, all grown up after a lifetime spent in this canvas world. But this doesn't mean that the story presented to us in The Unfinished Swan is the entire truth. The whole of what remains of Edith Finch has been infused with these fantasy elements and exaggerations to help take some of the pain away from these tragic events. So if we take this logic and apply it to Milton and Monroe's stories, I think again the truth is much more mundane, something where the core of the story is the same, just told differently. Maybe instead of a magical canvas kingdom, he just went off somewhere in the real world. Well, the Edith Finch world. And his estranged son did come looking for him, but instead of finding a king who's struggling to make his subjects happy and his creations last, he finds a struggling artist on his deathbed. The confirmation we're looking for is never given. But with a lot of these stories, that's kinda the point. Say this magical canvas world is 100% real, then I have no problem believing that the curse is real too. And then all ambiguity over whether it's a self-fulfilling prophecy is thrown out the window.
Whatever Milton had found in the house, Mom didn't want it getting out.
All we know for sure is it's a really creative tie-in between these two games that improves both of their stories, providing some backstory to The Unfinished Swan and a satisfying conclusion for Milton Finch, if you choose to believe it. Now it's time to talk about my personal favourite part of the game, the story of Lewis Finch. And just a quick heads up, these final two stories do involve a suicide. Again, nothing is shown and it's all very heavily implied, but still, click off the video or go to the end if it's something you don't want to hear about. Lewis is a young man who doesn't really seem to have much purpose. He spends his days working at the fish cannery, doing the same task over and over. Grab the fish, chop the head, and place to the side to be processed. But Lewis has a vivid imagination, so vivid in fact that it's likely he's experiencing maladaptive daydreaming, a condition where your daydreams become so intense they have a negative impact on your life. And we'll see throughout his story how these two parts of himself, his days at the fish cannery repeating this never-ending task, and his vivid imagination fight for control as he begins to lose his grip on reality. As we enter Lewis's perspective, we learn that he is newly sober.
As I see it, the trouble began in January, shortly after we convinced your son to seek treatment for substance abuse.
Not from alcohol, but a particular green plant, and without that escape from reality, he begins to notice how mundane this cycle is. And we don't just hear about it, we get to experience Lewis's routine firsthand, and this is where the game mechanics come into play. Using only one side of the controller, we carry out that same task repeatedly. Grab fish, chop head. And as tends to happen when doing the same thing over and over again, his mind begins to wander. And this is when we're introduced to the other half of the gameplay and we begin to use the other half of the controls, where we must guide Lewis through a labyrinth made up of simple white lines.
He said he started small, imagining a labyrinth.
Out of these two scenarios, only one contains mystery and wonder. The fish will never stop coming. He knows exactly what to expect, but this labyrinth could lead anywhere. His only limit is his imagination. But at this point, he's only dipped a toe into this fantasy, taking up just a small portion of the screen. Reality is still in control.
I spoke with his boss, but he said Lewis had become a model employee. Methodical, tireless, focused, like a whole new Lewis.
And all the while we're navigating this labyrinth, we're still chopping the heads off fish. It perfectly puts us in his shoes, having to balance these two different objectives at the same time. But of course, the imagination side of things takes a lot more focus, and as the story progresses, we get better and better at the reality side of things, until we don't even have to think about it anymore, as though we're on autopilot, and his fantasy just becomes becomes more detailed with every second that passes, a whole world being built around him, taking up more and more of the space that was once his reality.
He no longer spoke at the cannery, but his chopping was as reliable as ever.
Even the music, which started off as a simple banging of a drum,
he built the city up slowly, brick by brick,
grows into a triumphant anthem with multiple instruments.
Every day his imagination grew stronger.
It's clear that fantasy is winning this fight, and it's understandable why Lewis goes down this path. The cannery is grey, dull, made up of blood and metal, but in his imagination, he's a prince who sails across a colourful world, achieving everything he puts his mind to. He wins the elections.
He held an election for mayor, and he won.
He conquers cities.
He'd conquer a city, then immediately push on.
He gets the girl, or guy, depending on which route you take.
In Lewisburg, he heard rumours of a handsome queen.
Which, by the way, is a great choice, throwing in these 50-50 options that slightly alter his story, to make it feel like we're part of the decision making, building this world with him. But these options only give us the illusion of control, because whether you choose an electric sitar or a silver harp, there is only one ending for Lewis.
I still thought I could save him.
Eventually, the fantasy grows on screen until Lewis the cannery worker disappears entirely. We no longer have to use that side of the controller, because it's no longer a battle between these two sides of himself. His imagination has taken complete control, but given enough time, reality always wins. He'll have to come back at some point. He'll pass out from standing up too long, or get too tired to think, but Lewis will do anything to stay in his imagination.
He began to despise the man with a royal contempt.
So he separates himself from his body, travels up the conveyor belt, the same one used to carry fish, to a great hall where he's to be crowned king. But this isn't just a coronation, it's also an execution of Lewis the cannery worker. But you can't have one without the other, as unremarkable as he believes himself to be. This world is an extension of the real Lewis, but he's lost his grip on who the real Lewis even is, and he chooses the prince.
And then it struck him that the real Lewis was not the one chopping salmon, but the one climbing the steps of a golden palace.
He walks up to where he's to be crowned, and there lies a guillotine. He gets on his knees, and... The problem with comparing yourself to a version you've created in your head is that it's not a fair matchup. In your mind, you have much more control over everything, whereas reality is messy, unpredictable, but in your mind, you can simply imagine it and it's there. No boring logistics or restrictions. So it's no wonder Lewis fell in love with this world. It's just the degree to which he did that was the problem. To me, Lewis's is the most impactful story in the game, and essentially the last complete one, because Lewis's death is the final nail in the coffin for the Finch family home. Edith has now lost all of her siblings and her mother is done.
On the way back from Lewis's funeral, my mom told me to start packing.
She's had enough of this curse, enough of this house, and just like how it started all those years ago, she decides to take the very few Finches who are left and move away. And these Finches are Edith, Dawn, and Edie. And this makes for a very interesting dynamic, because now Edith's two influences couldn't be more different from one another, at least in terms of how they approach death. And for 7 years, moving away seems to actually work. But, like always, death catches up to them, and Dawn passes away just before the game begins. So, how did she die? Some tragic accident like Calvin? Or lost in a strange world like Milton? Well, not quite. As the Finch the most grounded in reality, it's only fitting that Dawn simply fell ill, and after a few years of fighting, it took her. her. It's not mystical or exaggerated, it's just life. She doesn't even have a memorial to walk up to like the others, because she passes away after great-grandmother Edie. This shot here is all we're given.
She got better for a while, and then she didn't.
So, what happened to great-grandmother Edie? Well, it all went down on the night they left. Edie is adamant she's not leaving this house. I mean, I can see where she's coming from. She's pretty much been here her whole life. And while for most, being surrounded by the dead all the time would be overwhelming, to Edie, it's kind of who she is. The way she sees it, everyone she's ever loved is all around her. But due to her age, she would struggle to live in such an isolated location all by herself, and rather than taking her with them, Dawn decides to put her in a home. And the argument between the two gets so bad that Dawn takes Edith and leaves that night.
That thing you're afraid of isn't going to end when you leave the house.
My children are dead because of your stories.
This is the last time that Edith would ever see her great-grandmother alive. And just like Dawn, there is no memorial to walk up to learn Edie's story. It's kind of ironic how the one who goes to such lengths to memorialize the dead doesn't herself get the same treatment. At this moment in time, she only lives on in Edith's memories. So what actually happened to Edie that night? Well, the only information we're given is that by the time the nursing home arrived the next morning, she's already gone. Which of course is very vague and gives little to go off, but there is this line earlier on about her mixing her medication with alcohol. But then again, she was in her 90s, so there's that.
Struck down in her prime.
But keep in mind, Edie has been alive for every single story we've played through. If anyone doesn't fear death, it's her. And even though Edie doesn't get a memorial like the others, we do get a look into her mindset through her very own journal, which she leaves as a gift, telling Edith all about the night she was born. The year is 1999. Y2K baby. Because of an earthquake out at sea, the tide is extremely low. So low in fact that for the first time in nearly a century, Edie can walk right up to the original Finch family home and step foot inside.
But I never thought I'd go back to it.
On her way down, she's greeted by memories of her dead loved ones, as well as items she hasn't seen since her childhood. And despite being confronted by the house her father died in, this trip down memory lane isn't painful for Edie, it's nostalgic.
Things I'd forgotten had ever existed. But when I saw them, they felt like old friends.
Yes, there's some sadness in there because of how things turned out, but there's a lot of good too. This isn't just a house that sank, it was once a home, a place where generations of Finches grew up, just like how the new Finch family home is more than just a graveyard. And the warm feeling that Edie gets when she walks down this beach is the same feeling that Edith gets when she returns to her family home.
That night, a lot of things came back to me. Or maybe I came back to them.
For the first time in years, I felt like I was home.
We even see a deer run past in both, visually linking these moments. These characters have the same name, the same experience, and now the same mindset. Because even though learning these stories hurts Edith, she admits that for the past 7 years, she's felt lost.
For the first time in years, I felt like I was home. And then I was alone. The last Finch left alive.
At least now, she has answers, and this is what ultimately sways her decision. She is going to pass down these stories to her unborn child. But the reason she's writing it down, rather than just telling them in person when they grow older, is because she knows, as a Finch, she could go at any moment. It's not just a journal, it's also a will. But instead of passing down belongings, it's passing down stories.
This journal was supposed to be for you. But now I hope you'll never see it.
Edith is the only one who truly knows what it's like to bear this burden, to be the last remaining Finch, and she could die unexpectedly whether she decides to pass these stories down or not. At least this way, if she does, her child won't be completely alone when the same decisions that haunt Edith get passed on to them. And it seems that she was right to prepare for the worst, because we know that this will of stories has been opened. Edith has been dead for quite some time, passing away during childbirth.
But I guess if you're reading this now, things didn't work out that way.
And really, it's not hard to see this coming. Every Finch's death we've played through has begun with some kind of text, but because Edith has no end date on the family tree, there's still some hope that she makes it out alive. But she's no different from any other Finch. Her story was set off way back in the beginning of the game, when we opened her journal on the barge. It's just been a much longer path to this inevitable ending, and now all that remains of Edith Finch is this boy, Christopher. And with the knowledge of the curse in his hands, the cycle of death will likely continue. Or maybe not. You see, looking back to the beginning of this story, to Odin's death, he was trying to run away from his problems. But now, things are different. Edith is making a conscious decision to face the curse and carry on the family history, inspiring her son to be hopeful of the future, not scared of it.
It's a lot to ask, but I don't want you to be sad that I'm gone. I want you to be amazed that any of us ever had a chance to be here at all. Good luck.
In this journal, she's not exaggerating things, she's laying out her experience and letting him come to his own conclusion. And because Christopher doesn't live in the Finch family home, it really is more of a graveyard now. He can come here and remember his family without being surrounded by them 24/7. He gets to decide, and when it all gets a little bit too much, he can simply close the book and walk away. I think it's a really nice middle ground between great-grandmother Edie and Dawn, because yes, it's important to keep the memories of the dead alive, but that doesn't mean focusing solely on their deaths, because out of all the things that make these characters unique, death certainly isn't one of them. Do I believe in the curse? I'd have to say no. As we've seen, there's a logical explanation for almost every one of these deaths, whether it's generational trauma, bad parenting, or just bad luck. Leave a hungry child in their room, they might eat some stuff. Build a swing next to a cliff, and someone might go over. Stay outside in a dangerous storm, and things might turn deadly. It's very likely that the idea of this curse came about from escapism, a way to justify bad decisions. I mean, even Edith herself is a part of this cycle. Knowing she was pregnant, she decided to walk along a thin branch to get back into the house. At night, all by herself and probably hours from the nearest hospital. What if she fell? Would she take accountability? Or would she blame it on the curse? So what's next for Giant Sparrow? It's been 6 years since Edith Finch came out, so surely they're cooking something up. Well, on their website, there's this statement, saying that their next game is going to be inspired by Windowsill, Spirited Away, David Attenborough nature documentaries, and the early animation of Winsor McCay and Walt Disney. I can't wait. I hope they stick with the bird theme. Sparrow, Finch, Swan. Nature people, please tell me what this bird is. So, my previous video was taken down. Blocked in every country, struck down in her prime. So I re-edited and re-uploaded, and it kind of lost all its traction, to be honest. But then, like goblins emerging from the woods, a bunch of you amazing folks came and commented, liked, some even re-watched it I think, which is honestly amazing. I'm continuing to be blown away by just how nice people on YouTube can actually be, because without every single one of these people, that video would have been dead and buried. So again, thank you so much, and thank you for watching this. Anyway, I've yapped enough. Thank you, I love you, goodbye. Wah.